Gluten talk. When baking sourdough bread, the worst thing that can happen is that you over-ferment your dough. You will have a very sticky, soupy dough, and that dough in the end is going to turn into a flatbread failure. If you don't ferment long enough, you'll have a flatbread as well. Nailing the fermentation process is the hardest part when baking sourdough bread. It's the single most important parameter that you have to master. Now imagine there was a magical tool that would allow you to master the fermentation process every time in a very reproducible manner. And there is, and that's a pH meter. It's sort of like a wizard's magic wand, but it takes a little bit of practice, and it's not as easy as it might seem on the first sight. So bear with me as I show you how to use this magical tool to your advantage. It's really an eye-opening technique.
This new method is super simple and works every time. You'll make the perfect sourdough bread much easier than using any other method.
So stay tuned and let's have some fun.
Normally I rely on a sample like this to monitor the progress of my sourdough fermentation, but sometimes this sample doesn't work, and that's where the pH meter comes in very handy. The pH meter allows you to check the acidity of your dough, and the acidity is a product of microorganisms eating your dough.
In your sourdough, you typically have the following microorganisms. You have yeast and you have bacteria. The yeast is mostly responsible for the leavening of your dough. The yeast produces a lot of CO2 and some ethanol. The bacteria is what gives your sourdough the typical sour taste. Now the bacteria also produces a little bit of CO2 and also some ethanol, but it mostly produces lactic acid and acetic acid. In a sourdough there are homofermentative and heterofermentative bacteria strains. The homofermentative bacteria simply produce lactic acid. The heterofermentative produce both lactic acid and acetic acid. And there are also homofermentative acetic acid bacteria. Now the lactic acid is actually 10 times more sour than the acetic acid. However, it seems that a majority of the taste of your final sourdough bread is actually coming from the acetic acid bacteria. And the balance between acetic and lactic acid bacteria in your sourdough is unique to your sourdough. We can measure the acidity overall. And this is the idea of the pH meter. We measure how much acid is inside of our sourdough, and that way we know that our fermentation is complete. However, this value that I'm going to show you in this video depends on your sourdough starter. It depends on your unique composition of microorganisms. That's a very important learning.
And two people helped me to arrive at this conclusion. Let me introduce you Jan-Peter. Jan-Peter has conducted a couple of experiments using his pH meter, and I want to share you his findings. So what you can see is that your dough starts to ferment, and then over time the pH gets lower and lower. It's a logarithmic curve. And then Jan-Peter continued to check the pH value at different dough size increases, and this is super interesting. If you look at this chart here, for instance, what you can see is that the dough increases in size, and then at some point it starts to collapse again. As the pH value gets lower and lower, the dough continues to collapse even further. And at some point the pH value levels out. This is exactly what you observe when you have a sourdough starter. At some point it just starts to collapse again. The second person I want to say thank you to is Laszlo. Please check out Laszlo's Instagram. Laszlo is the master of the pH meter, and he is baking amazing bread. We had a couple of great discussions. And he really is a believer that the pH meter is the next big thing in sourdough baking. If you check out some of his posts, he has detailed explanations on the pH meter as well. So thank you very much, Laszlo. Thank you very much, Jan-Peter, for having those great discussions with me. And let's go back to the recipe now.
So let's make the dough. I'm using 350 grams of bread flour, 50 grams of whole wheat flour, 8 grams of salt, 320 grams of room temperature water, and then of course some sourdough starter. And let's check the pH of the starter. It's at around 3.9-ish. So you can also use a pH meter to check how ready your sourdough starter is. In this case, the pH is already relatively low, so this starter could require another feeding. So in case your pH is very low on the starter, less than 4, I would be going for less starter instead of the dough. If it's higher, then you can go for more starter. So I'll be opting for around 10% sourdough starter for this bread. Now my starter is a liquid starter, This means that the hydration of the bread will increase, but that's okay. This is just something that you have to keep in mind. Treat this like water. So in this case, I'm going to be going for around 40 grams of sourdough starter. The final hydration will increase. So we will be, instead of at 320, we will be at 360 grams of water. And that's a final hydration of around 90%, calculated based on the flour. So it's a very wet dough. And not every flour can handle this. This really depends on your flour. So that's it. Dough has been done. Let's do some kneading. I'm gonna be using my stand mixer, but you could also totally knead everything by hand. I'm just feeling a little bit lazy today. I'm gonna be kneading this until the dough lets go of the bowl. That's a sign that the gluten network has nicely developed. The dough has been kneaded, and let's check the pH of the dough right now. Around 5.9-ish. I quickly want to talk about which pH meter you need. And you need to have one that has a spearhead like this. There are cheap ones like this one, but it's very, very hard to measure the pH without a spearhead. The way it works is the pH meter measures the current, and this way you know how much acid is inside of whatever you're measuring. The biggest disadvantage of this method is that a good pH meter like this costs around $200 US. This one is only around 15, but this one doesn't necessarily work. So the pH is going to get lower and lower the longer the fermentation continues. When should you stop the bulk fermentation? Because that's what started now. The moment we added our starter, the bulk fermentation stage starts with sourdough. And that's a great question. And this question can't be answered with a fixed pH value. This pH value that we're aiming for is something that uniquely depends on your sourdough starter and on your dough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be, regardless, extracting a sample, and I always like to observe a size increase. With a strong bread flour, a flour which has a high gluten content, I can go for a doubling in size. And what I'm going to do is, the moment my dough reaches this doubling in size, I'm going to be measuring the pH value. And this is the pH value that I should then go for. Your starter's characteristics and everything that shapes the pH value. So that's something you have to consider. So you can't just blindly follow a pH value. You have to figure out this pH value for your own dough. And that's why I was a little bit hesitant at the start to make this video, but I think this is a cool way how you can find your own unique pH value. All right, let's do it. Let's extract a small sample, and then the bulk fermentation starts. And just look at how nice this dough feels. So small sample, and a lot of you have asked me, how do I get this inside? And this is my trick. I just let the dough stretch. Look at this. Oh, magic. It's magic. Okay, now I failed. Anyways, It's gonna take a little while. I'm gonna round the dough up. And then, ooh, nice dough. Good looking dough. That was a little bit of work, but sample has been extracted. It's around 10 a.m. now. And now this is going to sit. I'm gonna wait until this doubles in size, and then we'll check the pH value. And then afterwards, I can always just be using my pH meter to double check the pH value from this dough. So simple. And the good thing is that if the temperature changes, then I can measure the fermentation progress directly on this main dough rather on this small sample. This small sample can heat up or cool down way faster than the main dough. So this is much more reliable. I just need to know my pH value. Around 4 hours in, the dough is already looking nice and puffy. I'm just gonna be giving this dough one stretch and fold now. During the bulk fermentation, I generally like to do one stretch and fold, typically more towards the end before you shape the dough. That just helps to give your dough additional dough strength. But stretch and folds also help to even out the crumb a little bit. And if you have time, it's not bad to do them because they just create additional strength, which means that your dough is going to rise upwards more in the oven. So if you are having issues with too flat bread, then do this. This can help. Also, it makes sure that the temperature evens out a little bit in case your room temperature changed. Good looking dough. We'll be doing one more stretch and fold. Sample has increased in size a little bit. While the dough is fermenting, there is going to be more and more acid piling up, and that means that the pH value is going to lower and lower. I'll check the pH value one more time once I see that this doubled in size. 7 hours later, our sample has doubled in size. And now it's time to measure the pH value, and that's the pH value that I know that I should use for the bulk fermentation. I'm gonna be testing both the sample and the main dough, because there could be a difference now. That's one of the problems that you have with a dough sample, because it can heat up faster or it can heat up slower. Around 4.2-ish. Let's also check the main dough. Almost exactly the same. I recommend to also check in different places because the fermentation speed might be different. 420. Okay, 421. This can't be. It's around, it's 420. So 420 seems to be the magic number for my dough, for my sourdough. So the 420 sourdough is now ready to be shaped. Based on the size increase, we now know that next time we ferment a dough, we don't need to look at the size increase anymore. All we have to do is we have to wait for the pH meter to reach 420. And that's exactly the moment when we should proceed with shaping our dough. In case I was baking multiple loaves, I would need to do a little bit of dividing and pre-shaping. So I would probably stop the bulk fermentation a little bit earlier, maybe at 4:30, so that my doughs still have a little bit of time to continue to ferment while they're sitting on the bench. So if you're running a larger bakery, that's something to keep in mind. Then not 420 is the magic number, it would be a little bit higher. But again, I just wanted to show you how you figure out the magic value at home. This is something that depends on so many factors. This is something that you have to figure out for your own dough. Please just use my value as a reference, but this is not the magic number that works for everyone. Okie dokes. Now this lost all its shape and I didn't also create any dough strength for this. I'm gonna be putting this into my discard stutter jar. I love making a delicious bread out of all that surplus. Discard is a bad name. Let's proceed and shape this. Great, so that's our shape dough. What I noticed myself, also just a ballpark figure for you, the moment that I'm below a pH of 4-ish, then my flour really starts to break down. But of course, this is also something that depends on your flour again and on your sourdough starter. But everything below 4-ish is sometimes not holding the gas, not holding the CO2 that has been created by the yeast so much anymore, and then it just starts to collapse and it starts to over ferment. Especially if you still want to shape your dough. When shaping, you always degas the dough a little bit, and then your dough is not able to recover anymore, even if you could still shape it. So you have to be a little bit careful. I'm now going to be taking this dough and I'll be moving it to the fridge overnight, just because I don't want to bake it today. I want to bake it tomorrow. That's when I like to use the fridge. And let's have a look at the pH value tomorrow. So it was at 4.2-ish now. And tomorrow morning, we're gonna check the pH value one more time, and I'm gonna be showing you something super interesting. See you tomorrow. Hello again, around 14 hours passed, and this is our dough. It looks nicely relaxed and it's ready to be baked. Let's check the pH. And do you see that? The pH is almost still at the same level. How can this be? This continued to ferment in the fridge. Something is definitely off. Let's talk about that.
And the problem is that the pH also changes with the temperature. Lucky there are a couple of tools to help you with that. So in this case, I'm entering a pH reading of 4.2 and a temperature of around 9 degrees Celsius. My fridge is set to 4 degrees Celsius, but it takes quite a while for your sourdough to cool down. So I think that's a realistic measurement. And then all you do is you press calculate and you'll have your corrected pH. So my pH right now before baking is around 4-ish. I think this is really cool because this allows you also to measure the fermentation progress inside of your fridge. Normally you would be doing something like the finger poke test, but that doesn't work on cold doughs, but this method does.
So let's bake the dough now.
I'm using upper bottom heat, and make sure that your oven is not heated to more than 230 degrees Celsius. I noticed in previous experiments, if your oven gets too hot, then that has negative effects. I'm gonna be baking like this for 25 minutes with the Dutch oven closed, and then I'll remove the lid to make sure we got that beautiful Maillard reaction to build the excellent crust. Let me pause here for a second. You might be wondering why there is a random picture of a cute little cat right now. Okay, there is actually no explanation. This was totally random, just like most of the ads. So, sorry. Now on a more pressing matter, have you ever seen a sourdough on a camel? Well, I take Brad Pitt wherever I travel. My goal is to create the most traveled sourdough on this planet. Hopefully one day I can make this channel my full-time job and geek out even more about sourdough. If you want to support me on my quest, please consider subscribing or buying some of this cool merchandise, such as a sourdough infographic. Infographic contains all the information you need to master the sourdough process from start to finish. Plus, it might look pretty cool inside of your kitchen. Now, let me end this very annoying advertisement by showing you an additional bonus picture of Brad Pitt on the road. It can be a bumpy road making sourdough, you know? Okay, that was a very poor joke. I'm out of here. Bye!
And voila, the final bread. Check this incredible oven spring out. Those beautiful blisters. Great coloring also from the bottom. This is the perfect sourdough bread.
Now, I didn't manage to slice this open yesterday. It's 1 day later. You can see it deteriorated just a little bit here on the top. But let's slice this open anyways and check how the crumb looks like.
Beautiful. Look at how nice and airy the crumb is. This is definitely the perfect sourdough bread.
One thing I would also like you to consider is the balance of yeast and bacteria in your sourdough starter. This method assumes that when you're making your dough, that you always start with a similar balance of yeast and bacteria. The yeast is mostly responsible for the leavening. So if you just look at the pH value, you know how much acid you piled up. But it could be that at the same time the yeast wasn't as active. This means your bread could be more fluffy or less fluffy. To really make this work, you want to have a consistent sourdough starter feeding schedule. This way you will always have exactly the same balance of yeast and bacteria throughout the fermentation. This method is great, however, if you don't want to run into over-fermentation, because the lactic acid bacteria and acetic acid bacteria are also eating your gluten network. And over time your gluten can't hold together as much. Now, by just looking at the acid, we know how much of your dough has been fermented. And that's really great to save you from over-fermentation. And yes, so your bread might not be as fluffy, but still you don't have that issue of over-fermentation. I think that's super important for a bakery. You don't want to serve your customers super flat bread. If it's a little bit less fluffy, that's okay. But an over-fermented bread, that would be a no-go. So if you're running a bakery, then I think this method could really work. But like I said before, please don't blindly trust my pH values that I showed you in this video. This is something that you have to figure out on your own. And for that, the trick to use the sample and then to monitor the pH value, I think that's the way to go. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. Hope you had fun. Thank you very much. And as always, may the gluten be with you.